It's the Real News Network. I'm Charmony Perez coming to you from Baltimore. France held its first presidential election on Sunday. The two winners of this first round was the political novice Emmanuel Macron with 23.9% and the far-right candidate Marine Le Pen with 21.4%. This is the first time in France's post-war history that neither candidate came from one of its traditional political parties. The Republicans and the Socialists neither made it to the second round. The Republican candidate, France Fillon, who was dogged by a corruption scandal, won only 19.9% of the vote, and the socialist candidate, Benoît Hamon, got a mere 6.4%. The other outsider, leftist Jean-Luc Mélenchon, closely missed the second round with 19.6% of the vote. France's political establishment was quick to urge voters to elect Macron during the runoff vote, which is scheduled to take place on May 7th. Here is what the first secretary of the Socialist Party had to say after the results were announced.
Marine Le Pen, présidente, ça, jamais. Il faut faire barrage à l'extrême droite et voter pour la République. En conséquence, le 7 mai, nous voterons pour Emmanuel Macron. Je le ferai sans hésiter, sans détour et surtout sans condition.
Joining us now from Washington, D.C. to analyze the results is Alex Main. Alex is senior researcher at the Center for Economic Policy and Research. Thanks for joining us, Alex.
Thank you, Charmony.
So, Alex, as we saw from the Socialist Party's secretary's reaction to the results coming in, everyone is saying that the French should vote for Macron in the second round in light of Le Pen's candidacy. What do you make of that advice?
Well, I think, first of all, I think it's important to note that almost all of France's political establishment was already backing Emmanuel Macron in the first round of the elections. And that's because the Socialist Party, in their primaries, chose to support a candidate on the left within the Socialist Party, someone who was basically against the establishment of the Socialist Party. Macron had been in the Socialist Party. He made a bet before this campaign that there would be turmoil and division within the Socialist Party, and he created his independent party. And indeed, there was division within the Socialist Party, and many had predicted that Manuel Valls, the former prime minister under François Hollande, would win the socialist ticket, and it ended up instead being the left within the Socialist Party, Benoît Hamon, who none of the establishment within the Socialist Party really wanted to support. So very early on, you had major defectors from within the Socialist Party, such as Manuel Valls himself. After having not won the primary, he chose to support Macron outside of the Socialist Party.
And Alex, do you think Le Pen has any chance of staging an upset on May 7th?
I think it's extremely, extremely unlikely. I know, everyone has chills from recent events, particularly the election in the U.S., in which, of course, no one had really predicted that Trump would win, and it came as a surprise, I think, even to the Trump camp. And of course, prior to that, you had the Brexit vote. In both cases, the pollsters got it very wrong. Here in this case, we're not dealing with small margins in terms of the polling differences. It's not 2 or 3 points. What we're looking at the moment in the polling that's already taken place as to how the French would vote in the second round of the elections is, a 20-point difference or more. So, they'd really, really have to have messed up their methodology to be quite that wrong. I think it's worth noting that in this first round, the pollsters actually were close to spot on. I mean, most of the major pollsters had pretty much predicted this outcome a week or two ago.
Now, back in 2002, Alex, there was a similar situation when Marine Le Pen's father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, made it to the runoff against Jacques Chirac. Back then, everyone also warned against voting for Le Pen, and Chirac won very handedly, I must say. How would you say France has changed since then, and what makes this runoff different? Are people really scared after the series of terrorist attacks that France has experienced, and including this recent one just a day before the election? Has that influenced the psyche, the political thinking of the people in France?
Well, that is an interesting thing. I don't think the most recent terrorist attack had much influence on this particular election. It certainly didn't in terms of the polling that we were seeing 2 weeks ago, again, which had predicted the outcome that we saw yesterday. There was no real difference that was provoked seemingly by this attack. I think really there have been a number of terrorist attacks in France, of course, over the last 2 years, and I think now that this has sort of been incorporated really into the French voting behavior. They've had enough terrorist attacks that if they're going to be influenced by those attacks, that's taken place already. Barring a major attack with an enormous amount of death and carnage, I don't think you'll see another terrorist attack having much of an impact.
Right. One of the other interesting things about Emmanuel Macron is that he's fairly unknown. His party he formed is unknown. He's unknown. He's very young at 39, never been elected to office before. He claims to be a post-partisan candidate. We don't know what that means. Give us a sense of what you know about him and what the electorate voted for.
Well, the electorate voted for the sort of most reassuring candidate, and Macron was the most reassuring candidate because I think the French media made him that way. Again, he was the one that was most palatable to nearly all of the French political establishment, political and economic establishment, I should say, particularly when François Fillon, the main right-wing candidate from the Républicains, particularly as his star began to fall after the corruption scandal, the incidents of nepotism where his wife had been paid for a fake job, essentially, with public funds for over 20 years. Once he started to be damaged by that scandal, the establishment rallied massively behind Macron. And I think, what's most astonishing is that given this media climate, that Jean-Luc Mélenchon did as well as he did. He has nearly 20% of the vote, which is really enormous considering the extent of the attacks against him in the media. He was attacked as being very anti-European, as being, an extreme far leftist. I mean, his positions were caricatured, and these attacks really intensified over the last couple of weeks of the campaign because Mélenchon had been rising in the polls. And I think perhaps he would have risen even further. His support would have risen even further had there not been as many sustained attacks against him. But it's quite remarkable because Mélenchon really represents the anti-neoliberal left. And in previous elections, we haven't seen the anti-neoliberal left get more than, well, in the last elections in 2012, the last presidential elections, Mélenchon got 11%. And that was already astonishing. Previous to that, the real anti-neoliberal left, when you brought together the various small candidates, only had 4 to 5% of the vote. Now we're talking about 20% of the vote. A candidate that's clearly anti-establishment, anti-neoliberal, and also has a very, very different foreign policy agenda from the establishment candidates. He wants to take France out of NATO. He wants to create financial institutions that will be alternatives to the Bretton Woods institutions. He wants to take France out of the WTO. So he does have a fairly radical stance, certainly compared to most French candidates in the foreign policy realm. Given all that, it's really quite astonishing that he did as well as he did with the 20%. And I think, he really does represent a major political force in France today.
And given all of the labor unrest and protests we saw in France, particularly last few months, prior to the election campaign really kicked off, against many, many labor unions, many people, teachers negotiating, trying to negotiate with the government, very basic issues of salary and issues of work hours and so on were being negotiated with the then socialist government. But no progress was being made, perhaps why Mélenchon was gaining in terms of support from people who were perhaps in the picket lines, unemployed youth, and so on and so on. There was a momentum growing in France, but that movement didn't really quickly back Mélenchon. Why was that?
Well, I mean, you have, particularly with unions, you have, of course, historical links to the more established parties, the Socialist Party and the Communist Party. And I think it's important to note that while the Communist Party did end up supporting Mélenchon in this election, and I think it's important to remind your viewers that, the Communist Party, while it is, very small compared to what it used to be in France, it is still a national party, and it still has a number of elected officials, both at the local and national levels of government in France. So it does still represent an important political force. And the communist leadership absolutely didn't want to support Mélenchon. In the end, it was the rank and file that pressured the leadership. They held a separate vote in which they called on the leadership to back him. If you see the links that exist between the communist leadership, the Socialist Party leadership, and the leadership of France's unions, it is quite understandable that they didn't systematically, support Mélenchon. But they may be rethinking their strategy, particularly as, and I think this is perhaps, the biggest event of this election, the French Socialist Party has really imploded. Benoît Hamon, the candidate, received only 6.5% of the vote. They've never had a vote that low, I think, since at least the late 60s. I think you're going to see a huge restructuring of the left in France, and one that is likely to see a new force on the left emerge, most likely with Mélenchon in its leadership, that has a very strong anti-neoliberal stance, in contrast with the positions, of course, that the Socialist Party has had over the last 2 decades.
Right. Alex, and finally, you referred to this earlier, which is, you dismissed the possibility that Le Pen could actually win in France. But given that polls have been so incorrect in other parts of the world, like in the US during the Clinton-Trump campaign, and in the UK with Brexit and so forth, one must entertain the possibility of off chance that Le Pen might win on the 7th. What would this mean for France if she does?
Well, it's hard to say exactly what it would mean for France. I think politically you would have massive divisions. I don't think the National Front, if she somehow did win the second round, I don't think that that would translate into a legislative majority, and you have legislative elections coming up in June. And so, you know, the government, the Front National government would, of course, you know, be met with enormous opposition from the parliament. So I think you would see a real political crisis emerge because, you know, the positions, of course, is so different. Again, I think this is very unlikely, the outcome that Marine Le Pen would win in the next round. But it is, you know, important to note that she's done better in this election than the Front National has ever done in the past. Her father did make it to the second round back in 2002 in the election against Jacques Chirac. But at that time, he only had 16% when he won in the first round and only got 17% in the second round. In this case, she is close to 22%. So certainly the Front National base is expanding. And I think, you know, that's something that certainly should be of enormous concern. And I think that is directly related to the failure of the economic policies of, you know, the governments, the socialist and center-right governments of France of the last couple of decades. These policies of austerity, of really cutting back the welfare state, and this entrenched high unemployment that you have in France, and it's making people, you know, vote more and more for Le Pen. She's getting an enormous amount of the working class vote in France.
All right, Alex, we will be keeping an eye on this and hope you can join us again for further analysis. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Charmaine.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.